everybody. Good to see you, and welcome to RiverGlen. RiverGlen's one church in many locations. And so everybody here in Waukesha, would you join me? Let's give a big welcome to everybody over at Pewaukee and online. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for joining us for church today. Before we get started, I want to invite everybody to the next welcome brunch coming up in 2 weeks on Sunday, May 5th at 10:30 at both campuses. If you're new, it's a great next step for you to take. Or if you've attended any length of time, love to have you come to welcome brunch. We tell you about our vision of the future, our beliefs. You get to meet some staff. You get your questions answered. You get one of these t-shirts, free t-shirt, free brunch. And I think you'll really enjoy it. You get to meet some other people as well. And you can go ahead and get signed up right now. You can take out your phone, scan the QR code in front of you, or just stop at the Next Steps Hub in the lobby after the service. Today we continue week 3. It's a series called Before You Lose Your Faith, talking about some of the main reasons for spiritual doubt in our lives that sometimes cause people to lose their faith and walk away. And we've looked at some big ones, some big reasons. The first weekend we talked about maybe they're going through some suffering and feel like God's let them down. Last weekend, maybe they had a bad church experience, church hurt, and they decided to walk away. But today, I want to talk with you about how many times it's not one thing, one decision. Very often, it's like hundreds of little decisions. And that's why today I want to talk with you about the subject of spiritual drift, because oftentimes, people don't lose their faith like in a day, or in a moment, but it's little by little, day by day, as they begin to drift. I came across an amazing drift story. It's actually in the Guinness Book of World Records. Many years ago, before cell phones and email, people would take a bottle, put a message in it, cork it, throw it in the ocean, throw it in a body of water, and, hope and pray that it drifts and somebody discovers it and reads the message. And so I looked it up, what's the record for the longest bottle drift? And there was an oceanographer in 1914. He released almost 1,900 bottles. He put a response card inside. He was measuring ocean current, and the card said, please put this in the mailbox, send it back to me. And so he sent these bottles in 1914, and one of the bottles floated and drifted for 98 years until somebody discovered it in 2012. That's a 98-year bottle drift, which shows us that drifting, that's not a real good strategy. Yeah, drifting is not a good way to get where you want to go. There's no guidance. There's no direction or power source. And the same is true spiritually. I mean, people don't drift into a better marriage or a better friendship. People don't drift into a better, stronger faith in God. People don't drift closer to God. Here's what happens. Here's what's true. In fact, the easiest way to distance yourself from God is to do nothing. Just drift. Don't pray. Don't read your Bible. Don't go to church. Don't serve others. Don't reach out and invite other people to come and hear about Jesus. Just do nothing, because we live in a culture where there's a current. And the current in our culture, it doesn't take you closer to Jesus. It takes you further from him. And really, the best way to distance yourself from God is to just do nothing. I wonder, can you think of a time in your life when you felt closer to God than you do, right now? Can you look back and go, oh man, I used to be so close to God, so much closer to God back then. It reminds me of this couple that were newly married, and they like to go for rides together in their truck. And, when they would drive places, they would sit close together in the truck. The husband would drive, and the wife would snuggle up right next to him, and, he'd put his arm around her. And, but it's been, now it's been 10 years, some time has passed. And now the wife is on the passenger side on the truck. And one day, while they're driving, she looks over at her husband and she's like, what has happened to us? We used to be this cute couple. We used to snuggle together in the truck. What has happened to us? And the husband looked at her and smiled and he said, I'm not the one who moved. Takes a minute, it kind of builds slow. But the point is, the truth is that if you have drifted spiritually, God didn't move. We're the ones that moved. The book of Hebrews talks about this in chapter 2. It talks about this concept of spiritual drift. And it says this, that we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we've heard, so that we do not drift away. And so how do you drift? You do nothing. How do you avoid drift? You pay careful attention. I read this came across an article about how we use our time. And the author talked about how oftentimes people will spend a lot of time on a vacation, planning a vacation, thinking about a vacation, stressing about a vacation. And, nothing wrong with vacation. Vacations are great. But the author talked about how you're going to do that vacation one time in your life. And it's not nearly as important as what you do every day in relationships and in your life. He said, what are the things you do every day? What are the things that you do 20 minutes every day? What are the things that you do 40 minutes every day? Because at the end of your life, when you add those things up, that is your life. So pay attention to, who do you have lunch with every day? How do you spend your time when you're driving in the car? Because our life is made up of our daily habits. And so let me ask you, do your daily habits bring you closer to God? Or do they take you further from God? The author of Hebrews wrote to believers because he understood that it's possible for us to believe in God and yet neglect God because we're focusing on other things. In other words, it's possible to be so focused on graduating that we drift from God. It's possible to focus so much on starting a career and building a career that we drift from God. It's possible to be so focused on boyfriend, girlfriend, on kids that we drift from God. It's possible to be a pastor and so focused on the church that you drift from God. Here's two words that I think really best describe drift. Drift is subtle and drift is incremental. In other words, it isn't dramatic. People are not renouncing their faith. I think many times people don't even realize that this is happening in their life, but little by little, day by day, we move until one day, we look at the shoreline of our life and we're like, how in the world did I end up all the way over here, God? Here's how we got there. Small drifts can produce great shifts. And so here's what I want to do today. I want to ask the question, how do we avoid spiritually drifting? Because the people in my life that I know who have said that they were Christians and now would say, no, I don't think that I am. It didn't happen in a day or, one moment. It was a bunch of little moments. It was seasons and years of drifting from God. So how do we avoid that? Here's the first way I think that we can avoid that, and it's to avoid isolation. So the writer of Hebrews goes on, he says, let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Going to church, watching online, that's a habit, the Hebrew author says. And you're either in the habit or you're in the habit of filling your weekends with other activities. But either way, it's a habit. And the question is, which one of those two habits is going to bring you and your family closer to God? I came across a study. This came from Harvard University. They put out this study recently. They did research on deaths by despair. Deaths by despair are related to depression and things like that. People just get to a place where they're in deep despair. And what they found was that there was one activity that would reduce deaths by despair by 33% for men and 68% for women. What was this one activity that would reduce it that much. And here's what it was: going to church on a weekly basis. And this wasn't a Christian organization, a church, didn't do this study. This is Harvard University doing research and finding, wow, there's one activity that'll reduce it, 33% among men, 68% among women, and it's going to church. I mean, it makes a big difference in your life, but drift is so subtle and incremental that many times we don't even realize that it's happening and where it can take us. I heard this quote, that people usually drift away from their community of faith before they drift away from faith. Now, I don't know if that's always true, but I think oftentimes it is. That before people drift, before people walk away from their faith, first they drift from their community of faith. And it's easy to do because it's easy to get a new job and your schedule changes. It's easy, when your kids start playing sports, or maybe you start playing a sport, and it's weekend intensive, and next thing you know, you're out of the habit. Now I realize I'm talking to people who are at our campuses and watching online, and that's great. I want to encourage you, but if you if you catch yourself watching this message later on, and you're like, I think I've gotten out of the habit. My hope and my prayer is that through God's power and God's Spirit that you would say, I need to get reconnected. Because, we want you here. And also because church is not just about receiving. Look again at this verse in Hebrews. Church is not just about receiving. It says that church is about encouraging others. It's about serving others. I mean, you can listen to the message. You can listen to the podcast on Monday morning, on your drive to work. You can listen to this message on your headphones, going around the lake on Tuesday afternoon. But what you can't do in that scenario is volunteer or serve somebody or encourage somebody. What you can't do, in that scenario is drop your kids off in an environment, in kids programming, that has been designed specifically for them to learn the Bible and to make friends with other kids. And what you don't get is the opportunity to worship with hundreds of other believers and just feel the inspiration of that moment. You miss out on that. Christine Cain's written a book called How Did We Get Here? She says, the connection to my church family helped me to stay anchored to Jesus and not drift far from his purposes for my life. She says, there's one thing that kept me anchored, every single week and helped me not drift from God. And it was going to church. But sometimes people will push back and they'll say things like, you don't need to go to church, to have a relationship with God because God is, everywhere. I mean, if you heard people say this kind of thing, you can worship God, going for a walk in nature, or on the golf course. I mean, you don't have to go to church. God's everywhere. It doesn't matter. But here's the tricky part about that statement. That's mostly true. That's partly true. Technically, you don't have to come to church to have a relationship with God, but those statements are not competing. They're enhancing. Oftentimes, coming to church, gathering for church, helps us develop a better relationship with God. And in the New Testament, I mean, we don't find this kind of thinking at all. I mean, Jesus never said, doesn't matter, you can worship, going on a walk in the park, or, you can worship in the deer stand. He never says anything like that. Scripture says, don't give up meeting together. And if you follow Jesus, I mean, why wouldn't you want to gather in a place like this and worship together and hear teaching from God's word? And you get an hour distraction-free, just you and God. I remember when Marnie and I, when our kids were really little, I mean, we would, when our kids were really little, we really were grateful for the kids ministry and volunteers in the kids ministry. You know how it is when your kids are little, and this is even before we started RiverGlen. We'd walk into church, and sometimes it takes heroic effort, parents, when you got little kids, just to get here. we would walk in, with bags, under our eyes, and one of our kids would maybe throw a tantrum, in the lobby, and on the ground. I'd pick him up, take him over to the check-in, and before I handed him over, I would be like, do you even want our kids today? And they'd be like, we're excited, we're excited to have your kids. We will take them in any condition that they might be in, and we could go to church free from distraction for an hour and get replenished and restored. And then we're excited to see our kids again when we pick them up. You don't get that in other places. And that was a great help to Marnie and I. And I'm so grateful that we have staff and volunteers that love kids and serve kids. And they love it when you bring your kids to RG Kids. And so you avoid isolation. And then here's a second way to avoid spiritual drifting. Check your intake. Now, what do I mean by check your intake? I'm talking about what you take in through your eyes and through your ears. When I was a kid, I feel old for saying that, but when I was a kid, we'd watch the news at 10 p.m. each evening. How many of you remember those days, watching the news? Anybody else? Yeah. Oh, yeah. News came on at 10 o'clock, and it ended at 10:30. And that was it. No more news. Until perhaps the next morning, if you received the morning newspaper. Times have changed, haven't they? Nowadays, it is 24 hours a day news, non-stop, through phones, radio, television, computers. I mean, there is so much content for us to take in. It can increase your anxiety. It can make you feel like you carry the weight of the world. Did you know that the average American takes in about 9 hours of media a day, 5 or 6 hours, on the phone, texting, social media, apps, an hour or two of television, an hour of podcasts or radios, and the media. I mean, they try to keep our attention because the media is a financial business. Nothing wrong with that, but the more clicks, the higher the ratings, the more advertisers, the more money that they make. And if we're not careful, it can consume us, and we've got less time and less energy for God. In fact, I brought my iPhone along today, and there's a new feature on the iPhone. Many people don't know about it, and so I just want to show this feature to you. If you hold down the button on the right here, I don't know if you can see this, and then you hold down the button on the left, it says swipe to turn off, and look at that. It turns it off, and it doesn't beep at you. It doesn't buzz at you, and you can leave it off for an hour. I mean, nothing bad is going to happen. Here's why this is important to check our intake, because what we watch or listen to will determine what we think, and what we think about will determine who we become. One author called this the law of exposure. It makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, what we see and hear is what we think about, right? And then what we think about shapes and determines who we become. It's the law of exposure. Now, there's probably 3 words that some of you are thinking right now, and here's the 3 words. It doesn't affect me. My phone, time on my phone doesn't affect me. Watching movies, watching television, listening to music doesn't affect me. And I can understand that line of thinking. If I were to watch a movie with some violence, I'm not going to go out and commit an act of violence. And so I understand that line of thinking, but I also believe that we underestimate the power of the law of exposure. John Morant is a star basketball player in the NBA, plays for the Memphis Grizzlies, 24 years old. And last year, he went on Instagram Live, and he waved a handgun. And the NBA suspended John Morant for a total of 33 games. Yeah, afterward, they asked Patrick Beverly, Pat Bev, who now plays for the Milwaukee Bucks, they said, why do you think Morant would do that? He's got wealth, he's got a bright future ahead of him. What do you think would cause him to do something like that? And I'm going to read Pat Beverly's quote, and this might be the first time Pat Beverly's quoted in church. And I also edited this for the sake of a church, so it's not the exact quote, but here's what he said. He said, "I think music has a lot to do with this now." He said, especially with this culture, everyone holding a gun in the music video is okay. Sad to say it shouldn't be based on our music, but it mostly is based on what we listen to. And that's how it is. Now, does he write about this? I don't know. In this specific instance, with John Morant, I don't know if that plays into all of it. But here's what I do know. People underestimate the law of exposure. Christian people, I think, underestimate the power of the law of exposure and how what we see and what we listen to affects our mind and our heart and our life. Here's what Jesus had to say about this. Jesus said, your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eyes are healthy, your whole body is full of light. Let me ask you, how healthy are your eyes? You can have 20/20 vision and have unhealthy eyes because you're taking in images that have a negative effect on your mind and on your heart and on your life and on your soul. Jesus said, your eye is the lamp to the body. In other words, you need to check your intake. People who drift from God oftentimes start by watching things, listening to things that pull them away from Jesus. That's oftentimes the very first step. Take a look at what God says about this. In Jeremiah chapter 2, God speaks to his people who have drifted from him. And he says, my people have committed two sins. Two sins. Number one, they've forsaken me, the spring of living water. And number two, they've dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. What's a cistern? We don't really use that word very often today. Well, a cistern, they used these in the ancient world. A cistern was a container that they would build in the ground that would capture rainwater. They would use cisterns to capture rainwater for the purpose of having drinking water. But notice the distinction here. God says there's a spring of living water. It's bubbling up. You can have it anytime, God says. He says this spring water, this living water is a relationship with me. But the people are like, nah, we don't want that. We're gonna dig a cistern, over here. We're gonna do our own thing over here. We're gonna do life without you, God. And it ended up having cracks, and it was dry, and it left them dissatisfied. And that's how many people try to live their lives today. Many people try to fill themselves up with, pleasure, entertainment, success, achievement, and it's like a broken cistern. It leaks. It's unreliable. It leaves people dry. That's why God says to us, there's a spring of living water, a relationship with me that can fill you up and satisfy your soul. So what do? How do we fill up on this living water to satisfy us so that we don't drift from God? I want to show you some real practical instructions that Jesus gave to the church in Ephesus. It's recorded in Revelation chapter 2. This entire church had drifted from Jesus, and Jesus speaks to them. Look what he says. He says, I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love that you had at first. Remember the love and excitement that you used to have for God, maybe when you first became a believer, a follower of Jesus. Remember how excited you were about church, about Jesus, about the Bible, reading the Bible, hearing from God and what you were learning and how God was working in your life. But Jesus says over time, some people lose that. Over time, some people forsake their first love. And so he says, consider how far you've fallen. Look at the shoreline of your life and how far you've drifted. And then he says this is brilliant. Repent and do the things you did at first. I think maybe a good illustration of that last sentence is marriage. A man and a woman attracted to one another, they start dating, they fall in love, they get married. And then 10 years have passed and they're just doing life together. Nothing wrong with that. But it's a life born out of their love for one another. But they got so focused on kids, remodeling the house, building careers, that they started to drift from apart. They started to drift from their first love. When Marnie and I first got married, somebody gave us some excellent advice that helped us to try and build some time into our schedule to stay connected with each other. Some people call this the 1-1-1 plan. And we started doing this once a day, finding at least 15 to 30 minutes to connect and talk with each other once a day. And then once a week, going out for dinner, going for a walk, spending the evening together once a week. And then once a year, getting away, even for a weekend, just the two of us. And that advice, that 1-1-1-1, once a day, once a week, once a year, has just helped us so much to remember our first love. And I know this is simple, but I wonder if that same principle applies to our relationship with God. What are your getaways with God like? Do you have time built into your schedule every day, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, once a day, with God, where you say, God, I need to slow down and just be with you and open your word and allow you to speak into my life once a day. And then once a week, do you have a non-negotiable commitment to come to church or to watch online? Because this is the anchor for my faith. And then once a year, maybe go on a retreat, go on a mission trip, something like that. What do your getaways with God look like to grow you and to protect you from spiritual drift? I want you to hear from a young woman in our church. She actually grew up in our church. And then she went away to college. And when she was at college, she began to drift spiritually. But she recognized it, and she made some changes. It's a great story. I want you to see it. Take a look.
My name is Claire Bach, and I've been attending RiverGlen for 23 years, my whole life. So I grew up going to church here. That's where I found the foundation of my faith, was through the programs here and through camps in the summer. So much so that when I was looking at colleges, I specifically wanted to go to a Christian college, which is how I ended up at Taylor University. And I was really excited for what Taylor could be. They have a really strong, small Christian community. I got to school and it was hard. The theater program was really intense, and I pretty quickly got into this place where I was idolizing that work. I really wanted to prove myself. I wanted to get acceptance and attention and be a person that people could count on and rely on. And I think when I started having that attitude, it wasn't a dangerous thing. But the longer I continued to search for that and desire that, quickly it became more important than anything else in my life. And I didn't realize that in that stress and anxiety of trying to hold on to my identity and my work, that suddenly I wasn't talking to God. And because I wasn't getting satisfaction or fulfillment in that work, I started searching for that in other things. I entered a relationship where it wasn't healthy, it wasn't God honoring, but I was looking for attention anywhere I could get it. I was looking for acceptance anywhere I could find it. And I just drifted. It wasn't that I was I don't believe in God, but I wasn't thinking about it. I wasn't praying. I wasn't talking to God. I wasn't close to him in the way I was when I grew up. And I was working on a production of Macbeth, and it was one of the hardest shows I'd ever worked on before. It was a crazy set in a short time period, and I was feeling burnt out and exhausted, and I didn't know what to do because it felt like I couldn't keep living the way I'd been living. And I started hearing and seeing these things online about a revival that was going on at Asbury College in Kentucky. The week before the show, it was midnight, we get in a van after our rehearsal. We drive 6 hours to Kentucky, and we show up, and it's pouring rain, and the chapel is closed. And this little old lady walks up, and she goes, do you need somewhere to go tonight? And we went, yeah, sure. And she takes us down the road to this little Methodist church and walks in the door, and it's completely empty, and it's just calm, complete peace. And it was the first moment in months that I had just stopped and paid attention to God's presence. God is so cool that he created this space for us to worship together. And it wasn't the huge revival they were expecting. It was that like intimacy and relationship that we all were desiring and needing. And we sat and we prayed for one another, and we talked about what we were needing spiritually and emotionally and physically. And we like looked at one another in the eyes, and we like saw each other for who we really were and not just the work that we were doing. And that was kind of like the turning point for me. We drove back to school, and I suddenly was like, I gotta do something different. After experiencing a season of like feeling far from God, in order to like take steps to get back to my faith, I decided I wanted to get involved. I wanted to not let myself be isolated like I had been in school in the time that I felt far from God. And so as soon as I graduated college and I moved back home, I dove in and I got involved. Almost immediately, I get a text from Garrett that was like, hey, what about, have you thought about being a leader at Unite? Like, I'm looking for people. And I was like, yes, actually. This week I was praying about it and thinking about it, and I joined that team. And then I was like, I need to find a group. And I decided to do Rooted, which was kind of a like random moment of like, I know I'm gonna be young, I know I'm not gonna know anybody, but I want to know God better, and I want to build a foundation of my faith so that I don't end up in the same place that I did before. If someone is feeling far from God, if they felt like they've drifted away from Him, I think the thing that I would remind them to think about first is grace. To let yourself not feel ashamed that you've drifted from Him. Just because you feel far from God doesn't mean that He is far from you. He's right there with you, and He's just waiting for you to like turn to your right and see Him.
Yeah, let's give Claire a hand. That's a great story. I appreciate Claire sharing that. I appreciate her openness. How about you? You know, when you look back on your life, have you drifted? You know, the last 6 months, last year, the last several years, would you look back and go, God, you know what? You know, I used to be so close to you. I used to love you so much. But now, God, I'm drifting. And if that's you, I want to ask you to do 3 things, okay? First, I want to ask you to look at your daily habits. Man, do you have a time every day, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, just you and God to connect with Him? Do you have a non-negotiable commitment each weekend to come to church or to watch online? This is the anchor to my faith. Look at your habits. And then second, I encourage you, do the things that you did at first. That's what Jesus said to this church at Ephesus. Repent and do what you did at first. That's what Claire did in her life. And so if you used to be in a small group, do that again. If you used to volunteer and serve others, maybe you served the kids, do that again. If you used to follow a daily Bible reading plan, do it again. You know, maybe the greatest way to start is just download the YouVersion app, and that'll give you access to the RiverGlen Bible reading plan. Do the things you were doing when you were close to God and loved Him the most. And here's what I think will happen. You will remember your first love. And then third, I really like what Claire said. Give yourself grace. Don't beat yourself up. You know, if you've drifted, take the next few moments as we share communion together to identify that drift and to recommit your life to following Jesus.